now we're finding ourselves at a time and place where everything is just bursting with life. It's amazing to observe because both Francois and I work from the outside now, sitting on the table that I'm sitting, and they're, peonies like in the garden. How at lunchtime there'll still be a bud, and by 4:30 in the afternoon they're full blown flowers. It's like so amazing to see this action packed, like, the way of nature catching up with the season. Same thing with the vines. 2 weeks ago, forget about 2 weeks ago, like a week ago, not even a week, like last Friday, there was not even a bud. I mean, there were buds, but they were like tightly closed. And then when we drove in the morning on Monday, there were leaves everywhere. It's like fascinating. Like it's hours. And sometimes, when we sit here and at the end of the day, when everybody goes home, um, I don't know whether everything comes to the fore even more, or whether we're more tuned to seeing it because we're not writing emails and running around. The amount of life that happens around here, it's amazing. There's like rabbits running everywhere, obviously the squirrels. I have a little fountain behind me that I just turned off the pump for, in order not to mess with the sound. But even that has been, like, just watching it has been amazing, because all these like little birds come, like, take baths, go away. The ducks are everywhere. So I'm like, oh, forget about being in the cellar right now. This is where the action is. I don't know how the light will work out, but if it doesn't, I'll just like move inside over here. So bear with me if you see any issues, just let me know. Okay, somebody's telling me that the video connection is not very good. So I'm gonna go this way. Please let me know if it doesn't correct itself, and I will go inside, because the internet is the internet, the ruler of us all. But what I was hoping to do today is have a slightly nerdier talk, not because we are nerds over here. Previously, we've always concentrated on certain grape varieties, and now I want to concentrate on something that it's way more universal and give you a perspective of how we think about it, how we interpret it, why it is so important. And all of that thinking actually finds its concrete results in the way we release the cuvées that we do. Some of you that known us for a long time know that we don't necessarily, if rarely actually, release the different wines that we have in sequential order, meaning 2014 or will not always follow 2013. Currently we have 2017s on the website, but some of the 2016s and most, if not all of the 2015s have not been released. And there are very specific reasons for that type of thinking that I'm gonna go through now. And what I also wanted to say, that because when we advertised about this talk, I said to people, open any kind of wine from Pearl Morissette that you want. So I want to reserve a little bit more time for questions. And if some of you or most of you are enjoying different Pearl Morissette wines, I imagine it'll be a multitude of different vintages. And feel free to, when we go to the question period, to ask me any questions about these wines and those vintages, because we will naturally start discussing the structures that inform these wines. So I'll like try, like pretty much I guess what I'm saying is that I'll try to keep myself as concise as humanly possible, at least to me, and then like reach towards the wines that you have with you right now as an examples of what I will be discussing conceptually in the first time in the first part of the talk. So structure, what is it? What is it not? It's for sure a part of our, what I call the Holy Trinity at Pearl Morissette, even though there's been a few other things added to the Trinity, so it's no longer a Trinity. So for us here, if you haven't heard me or heard Francois talk before, uh, and that's your first time of hearing me say it, like the most important things in wine are structure, texture, and balance. Alongside that, transparency and purity are very important. But whenever we work with these wines and try to uncover who they are, this is what we concentrate on. We don't concentrate on outside characters. We don't concentrate on, you know, aromatics and trying to categorize those aromatics, whether it's Golden Delicious Apple or Granny Smith, or is it a citrus peel or a citrus flower? That's not what we work for. Those things are naturally there because, as Francois often says, it's fruit juice. Of course, it's going to have some sort of fruit flavors in it. What we try to understand and uncover and represent with our like utmost sincerity and transparency is the core of the wine. And so that core for me is made out of structure, texture, and balance. And if I can give you an image to think about, imagine the human body structure would be the bones within it, texture is the flesh, and balance is how they obviously relate to each other. Everything outside of that is the superficial layer. It's the color of your skin, you know, the color of your eyes, and so on and so forth. It's not something that a lot of people discuss, but I also do truly think that the best gastronomical wines in the world and some of the wines that have the most impact on people um, have that impact because they do possess that trinity, because and by virtue of that they allow you to experience texture and structure in the mouth the way you would with any beautifully composed dish. So now there's a very different thing though between food and wine. That is that food structure, or like any like dish structure, can be manipulated through cooking methods and so on and so forth. We do not manipulate the wines. We do not work with prerequisites in terms of how they're supposed to be. We observe and try to represent what is already there. And what is already there is not a product of anything to do with human intervention, and it's everything to do with plant life and everything that it involves. The climatic conditions during the vintage, the age of the vines, and then obviously the variety itself. So I'm gonna start breaking these down slowly but surely. I'm sure a lot of you have heard me say before, and this is something that I learned from Francois when I came from the sommelier world into the production world, that you have to think of the grape variety as nothing more than a vessel. It's way more prevalent today as an idea than it was 10 years ago, because there's a, you know, historically there's been a discrepancy between how the old world and new world think about wine. So you see varietal labeling in new world wineries where supposedly you know a lot about the wine if you know what the grape is inside. So in the New World, you see a lot, this is Chardonnay, this is Pinot Noir. This is the most important thing that you need to know about the wine. While in the Old World, Burgundy being the utmost example of it, but it's prevalent all over the Old World, you don't see the name of the grape, you see the name of the region, and the name of the vineyards, and so on and so forth. What that means to say is that for them, what the grape variety is arguably expressing, it is way more important than the means through which that thing is being expressed. Um, but supposedly, initially, when wine started coming into the New World, it was way too complex a proposition to know, how Chambol Musigny is different than Nuit Saint Georges, and take that another step further to understand that they're both made out of the same grape but can possess completely different characteristics. So the varietal labeling became the norm in the New World. Now, I'm not saying one is better than the other, or I guess I am saying that, because there is a part of me that definitely thinks that if everything that a wine can express is its grape, that's rather like simple. Um, it's I like to tell the story how in Burgundy, if people want to actually offend you or give you a passive aggressive compliment, and they're tasting your wine, red wine made out of Pinot, they would say c'est Pinot, like it's Pinot, and that's not meant in a complimentary way. That's meant to say that the only thing that wine is expressing is its medium. It's not its origin. It's not anything else. It is the basic step of understanding the wine. Because if you understand the medium, you understand the primary characteristics of things, but you will not be able to delve deeper into the subtleties that bottle or the grapes from that vineyard are able to provide. In Burgundy, obviously, the argument is that Pinot and Chardonnay and whites are such transparent grape varieties that you can read terroir and nature through them and understand the soils and so on and so forth, which is obviously like a very valid thing. Here in Niagara, however, and I'm not saying it's not valid here, I think it's slightly presumptuous to start talking about these things before we fully understand what Francois calls the three most important factors of terroir in Niagara. And they're like 1, climate; 2, climate; 3, climate. It is amazing, absolutely amazing to see the different growing conditions from one year to another. It's amazing also to see the immense imprint they have on the finished wines, and being able then to differentiate between the soils. It's not a matter of it's not there, it's a matter of like, let's work through like that layer before we start discussing like even finer and more nuanced things. So any of you that have been here at the winery for a tasting over the years, you know that there is a certain like chip on the shoulder attitude when it comes to discussing two main things. One is quote unquote minerality. The next one is quote unquote rocks. Because even when we talk about soils, for us, it's way more important to talk about the life in the soils, the energy they're able to give the plants, and all of those things. And those are very real, very impactful things. But that being said, we as a wine producing region can only trace the outlines of that influence. What we can start discussing with honesty and with some a sort of like touchable, like pragmatic experience is the amount of imprint that the different growing conditions have. I wouldn't be exaggerating if I said that one of my biggest discoveries over the years here, during my transition from a sommelier to a production person, has been to understand, not necessarily through intellectualizing it first, but just through the perception of tasting, um, how structure of the wines from the same vintage is absolutely like I don't want to call it identical because it's not 100% identical, but it's parallel within each other wine with very slow little deviations within each wine from the same vintage, I mean. And that is completely regardless of the grape variety itself or the age of the vines. That blew my mind because, and seeing it repeat year after year after year, and not only that, but seeing it hold true for the wines that now have been aging and we can continue exploring, is the exact opposite of what you're taught as a sommelier. Um, the grape variety itself obviously has a say within it, like, you know, Chardonnay versus Riesling versus Cabernet Franc or Pinot Noir, those being the four ones that we have the most experience with. But if you look at the block of wines from one vintage and compare it to the same wines from a different vintage, you see that there's way more universality on a deeper level between wines made from completely different grapes of the same vintage as opposed to the same cuvee from two different vintages. I don't know if I said this correctly, but not correctly, understandably. But what I mean is something that we find more and more, like, or at least for us, it becomes more and more obvious as we delve deeper and deeper and we start comparing the wines from older vintages, or the wines that have that are made from grapes that have relatively similar attributes from different regions of the world. Wine is way more universal and way simpler than people give it the credit to be. But in the course of understanding that, or while we get to accept it as a fact or as a wisdom, everybody's busy in concentrating on the differences. And obviously there is nothing wrong with that, but I just like feel it kind of slows you down from getting both a deeper understanding and bigger pleasure from the wine. So when it comes to structure, that is certainly one of the most, like, you know, one of, for us, the three most defining characteristics of a wine's character. And you see us, as I mentioned earlier, releasing 2017 before 2015. Now I can give you the very straightforward explanation as to why. 2017 have a much, like, if you think about them in general, and again, that is valid across all grape varieties, their structure is a canvas that is much more flowy. It allows more air, more light in, like the bones are finer and allow more movement, as opposed to something from the previous vintage, 2016, that has like extremely strong, like like big bones, and the canvas is much more static. Both vintages possess a lot of energy, But in order for the 16s, the more static vintage, to give you as much pleasure, as much energy, as much quote unquote entertainment as the 17s, their pathway towards that will take a long time. Same thing, comparing the 17s to 2015. Like the 15s have, like, they do have strong bones, more like stronger bones than the 2017, but they also have a lot of flesh. 15 was a warm slash hot, but more on the warm vintage. um it wasn't excessively dry or anything like that, but it produced wines that have a lot of substance, a lot of matière, a lot of like flesh on them. It's the kind of wines that if we are to release right now, most people will absolutely love, because there's generosity there and richness that, even when not fully unfolded, invites you and comforts you and really envelops you. However, it's not necessarily our taste. And it's not because it's not our taste, like the way these wine, the richness, like we have absolutely nothing against richness, but what we know, having been here from, flower blooming like in the vine to grapes, is the understanding that there's so much more delicacy and nuance within those grapes, within those wines, that if we are to release them now, we like, and knowing that most people would open them, you know we do have a lot of customers that sell our wines, which is absolutely great. But everybody wants to try it. They will be showing you about 15 to 20% of what the wine actually carries inside it, in terms of um, precision, in terms of nuance, in terms of full self-expression. So we are fortunate enough, so far, to have been able to skip vintages and go back to vintages, both because we had a 2014 vintage, which is a relatively easy vintage, giving, it never had any attitude issues whatsoever. That's how, like, the finer structured vintages are. Then we had two extremely deeply rooted, structured, and serious years, like 2015 and 2016. And then came a year like 2017 that we were able to bottle again, because of the character of the wines, because the point where all of the components of every single one of those wines comes together, like, it happened earlier, and it only happens earlier when the wine itself doesn't have so much to digest, like whether it's strong bones like in 2016, or a lot of like flesh like in 2015. So we technically, with a few little exceptions that we released in between, but only because we did not have a wine for a long time to that we were happy to release to people. We went from 2014 to 2017, and then we slowly started working with the 15s and 16s. We bottled our last 15 like 10 days ago, which was the most serious 15. It's a Cabernet Franc that ended up being in vessel. It was in one of the foudres for, well, close to like 5 years, 4.5 years. The 2016 Cabernet Franc, like Cuvée Madeleine, that will go into bottle in September, while the 2017 Madeleine has been in bottle since last September. So we're like jugglers trying to work with the different shapes and forms that the vintages provide us with. So far, so good. Again, this is a situation that we're very privileged to be able to act upon and entertain, because there's two other aspects of it. You know, people in Burgundy, like with long established reputations, they release young wines that are certainly not ready to drink, but they also do not care because everything sells right away. And normally when you're paying the amount of money for top burgundies that you have to pay in order to acquire them, you're way more likely to store them, or you're like really like a big nerd or an aficionado that is not struggling with the idea of, like, I bought a wine, like, let me now forget it for the next 10 or 15 years. You can do that with the top cuvées here at Pearl Morissette. But we also find it a little bit, it's not presumptuous. It's just, we don't think it's fair to ask this of our customers. So we try to find a compromise where we will only release the wines from whatever vintage that they're from when they've reached the point of unity within themselves that is able to give you pleasure. Apart from that, is the wine capable of going for 10, 20, 30, 40 years? Absolutely, yes. Traditionally speaking, 90% of the wines that we've produced so far, okay, maybe that's an exaggeration, 80% of the wines that we've produced so far have been from our top vineyard, 19th Street Vineyard. So this is Cuvée Black Bow in Riesling, Madeleine in Cabernet Franc, 19e in Chardonnay, and Pinot Noir. Every single one of those wines in every single vintage will go for at least 10 years. Just yesterday, I opened the first Black Bow, the 2010 Black Bow. Now that's a Riesling. It's the first Riesling that was done, like, you know, that was allowed to ferment dry. It was kind of it holds a very special place in my heart because it's the wine that brought me over to Pearl Morissette, because I was fascinated by it. It was so different, but it was so delicious. Historically, this is the first time Francois did Riesling the way he wanted to do it. Just let it be. But he didn't do it in any way, shape, or form that imparted any additional structure on the wine. He fermented it in stainless steel, which is something that we rarely do these days. It's the wine made in the simplest of ways. Now, 2010 was a big vintage just in terms of like structure, and having a 10-year-old Riesling made in a stainless steel tank that is completely dry and not seeing an ounce of tiredness within it, but just a deeper and deeper harmony and unraveling of the nuances that are there, it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing, because that is not a product of necessarily our skill or knowledge. Again, Francois had never made the Riesling before, but it's a pure reflection of what Niagara fruit it can give you if you're courageous enough to allow it to be what it wants to be. So we're talking about, they were planted in 1999, so 1999, 2010, like 11-year-old vines. Those are not even old vines by European standards, or like North American standards for that matter. But you have a 10-year-old completely dry white wine made in stainless steel, shining with purity, shining with freshness, 10 years in. And that is a measure of the structure that this wine has, and that structure is a measure of the growing season itself. So the more structure you have within a wine, the more longer lived those wines will be. And as I said, you can take it for absolutely granted that every single wine from every single vintage from our 19th Street vineyard, uh, the minimal amount of time where it actually shows any kind of peak is 10 years. And we are yet to see that um, with any of the wines produced there, but I can see how some of the vintages, like 2011, which was a finer vintage, is slowly approaching that moment. What we hold ourselves responsible for is to try and hold back these wines as much as we can afford in order to be able to offer them to everyone at a point where they're not only expressing like the most obvious things, but are starting to talk in a more eloquent, more nuanced language and engaging you with aspects of wine that are less and less seen these days. And in certain vintages, as I said, that moment with which we are comfortable with releasing the wines happens earlier than in others. It's happened earlier than in 17 than in sorry it happened early in 17 than it did in 15 or 16. And then in other vintages, you will have, and that's probably can answer a question that I'm sure a lot of you have had if you've been drinking Pearl Morissette wines for a while. You have a wine somewhere, whether it's a restaurant or a bottle that you already own, and it's beautiful, and then you have it, I don't know, a couple of months after, and it's completely different beast, and you're like, what is happening? Like, that's not the wine that I remember. And what is happening, that wines, just like people, have their moods and have their open and closed phases. So the more open a wine is, like the more structured the wine is, the more of these ups and downs it'll have. And there's nothing you can do in that moment apart from breathe deeply and let it breathe for an extended period of time. Um, the more nuanced, elegant, like free-flowing canvas vintages, like 2017 and 2014, have way less of these, what I call them, attitude problems. But I'll give you a very simple example. 2016 Chardonnay Cuvée 19e was having a grand moment last year. It is a very structured wine, but we had been tasting it from March until like through the summer, because that's where wines really show their attitude, going from spring into summer, from summer into fall. And it was great. It was beautiful. Like, it was open, it was flowy. And because we had not had any Chardonnay to offer anyone for, I think at that point would have been like 3.5 years, like, you know what, let's go for it. The wine is consistent, so on and so forth. So we released it, it like people bought it, and the wine closed. Like by November or December, whenever it was, the wine completely shut down. I don't know that I can count the number of emails I've written to people since that have had the Chardonnay, have tasted it previously on a couple of occasions, have absolutely fallen in love, and they were then opening a bottle and having a completely different experience. And for us, this is something that it's always it's not good, right? Because you sit down for a meal, you had that wine a month ago and it made you fly. You're having it now and it's like smells completely different, it tastes completely different. And what is happening? What is happening is that the wine is closing in on itself in order to be able to resolve like deeper sides of its structure, and when it re-emerges, it's going to be glorious. Were we able to predict that? Absolutely not, because we saw it being stable for a long enough period of time, stable in terms of the way it was drinking, that we're like, okay, I guess that's what the 16s do. And then, we released it. Everybody was very happy. And then the wine started giving the middle finger to everyone. And this is like, these are those intricacies of nature where at the end of the day, what I can give you is our best hypothesis of what we know so far about the wines from the vintages we've produced and how they're behaving, and general guidelines like 2011s, 2014s, 2017s are some of the most flowy wines. They've never, even when they go tight, even when they close in on themselves, um, it takes it like it's even sometimes like hard for us to identify it, but we can only identify that the wine is close because we've experienced it very open. What I'm saying is that the difference between open and close is so minute in there that it doesn't really make that much of an impression or any difference of the overall enjoyment of the wine. Then on the other side, the wines with serious structure, like, and I don't mean to make a qualitative assessment here. Like when I say serious, I mean like bigger, whether it's bigger in roots or bigger in bones or bigger in flesh. 2012, 2015, 2016, 18, those are wines that are obviously like still in the cellar. And 13 is right up there as well. When those wines close, it's a whole different, like it's, you go from white to black, or not white to black, you go from left to right, like completely different sides of the face. The one good thing about, if you're a nerd and if you enjoy thinking about that, the one good thing about having a wine when it's closed, that it may not be able to give you the pleasure that you were searching for when you opened the bottle, but what it gives you, it is the blueprint of its structure, the blueprint of its bones. And those are things that if you want to understand wine a little bit deeper, are very, very, very helpful. So the vintage variation is, like, for us, and vintage variation not only in the way, is, most people say, is that a good vintage, is that a bad vintage? If you're working with grape varieties that are adapted to the environment, the difference between a good vintage and a bad vintage is your skill. That's it. It's very straightforward. I think there is an old Burgundy saying that you realize who the actual good winemakers are in bad vintages, because everybody can make a good wine in a good vintage, but recognizing the beauty that every single grape will carry, regardless of how hard its growing conditions have been through the vintage, and honoring that and still producing wine of structure, texture, and balance, that requires skill because it challenges your ideas of what, you know, Chardonnay or Pinot or Cabernet Franc from this vineyard should be. For us, it's the transparency that I continuously talk about, or the balance that I continuously talk about as well. One of its pivotal anchors, it's the ownership of the vintage itself. The fact that if 2014 and 2011 are vintages with a more open, flowy canvas where the sunlight rushes right through, if that's their spirit, don't try to complicate them. You're not gonna make them more complex. You're just gonna complicate them and take some of their spirit away. At the same time, if you're looking at vintages like the structured ones that I was talking about, 12, 15, 16, and 13, if the wines have attitude, let them be. Like, let them resolve themselves, because at the end of the day, once they emerge out of those troughs of closedness that they go through, what awaits on the other side is something much more magnificent than you could have possibly imagined. So, why that happens across varieties is fascinating. And as I was saying before, it's been one of my biggest realizations here, that the different grapes from the same vintage can make wines that are parallel in structure, and that deeper side of structure, it's a representation of the stresses that they've been through, because whether it's Chardonnay or Pinot or Cabernet Franc or Riesling, they're living through the same season, whether it's drought stress or too much water stress, whether it's not enough sunlight or too much sunlight. Grape variety produces, like, will give you inherently its own characteristic, like a little bit more acidity or a little bit more tannin or less, and so on and so forth, or richer phenolics. Like, everybody carries a little bit of that. But at the end of the day, if you look at it, like, by stepping away from it, you realize that what the grape variety is just a connection between the defining factors that actually are so much more important to wine than the variety itself. What is in the soils and what is on the outside, what is in the aerial side, and that is, climate, and what those grapes, or sorry, those vines have been through in the winter, or what those the buds have been in the, like, in the previous vintage, because obviously, like, the harvest that we're gonna, like, just to make sure that everybody knows, the harvest that we're gonna have this year, 2020, those are not buds that happen now, they happened last year. So the memory of everything that's gone through then until now, it's shared by all the different grape varieties. And I'm I'll be fascinating it'll be fascinating to know if somebody can actually break this down scientifically. But to me, what's been such an amazing thing to discover is the fact that what you've been taught matters the most in terms of grape variety, or rocks and so on and so forth. It's only like a minute part of the picture, and without being too much out there, I would also say not the most important one. The character of the wine, at least in our view, based on what we consider important, is definitely way more defined by those much more complex propositions that very few people discuss. But how can Cabernet Franc and Riesling from the same year have a more similar structure than Cabernet Franc from the same vineyard between two, Cabernet Franc from the same vineyard from two different vintages? Let's say Madeleine 2012, Madeleine 2014. I can tell you that Madeleine 2012, it's way closer to Riesling 2012 than it is to Madeleine 2014. Now, if you concentrate, obviously, like on the color of the wine, yeah, of course, they're different. If you concentrate on the fact that Cabernet Franc is spicy and has red dark fruit, and Riesling is like more, white fruit, floral, so on and so forth. Yeah, of course, those are distinctions. But if you put your sight and put your gaze on your appreciation into what's within the core of those wines, the similarities between two grapes as different than Cabernet Franc and the Riesling from the same year is like extremely much more relevant. Structures are extremely much more similar than between two Cabernet Francs from two very different years. And I mean, I don't want to get too nerdy. I know I already am. But why I wanted to talk about that, at first it started with, because somebody asked me, why do you release this before this? Or I bought such and such vintage, but I don't think I have the previous vintage. I'm like, oh, it's not been released. And I'm like, why hasn't it been released? I'm like, oh, that's a good thing to address with people, and to give them also a perspective of when you have a few different vintages from Pearl Morissette in your cellar, and you wonder which ones to drink, drinking the oldest is not necessarily always the wisest thing to do. And that would be the common wisdom that everybody's advised to follow most of the time. But it's much more complex than that. So if you have different vintages of Pearl Morissette in your cellar and you're wondering, like shoot me an email, or if you're drinking whatever it is you're drinking, or you have been wondering about the different Pearl Morissette wines in your cellar, just go into the chat and ask me some questions, and I'm happy to answer all sorts of questions about structure. Again, as I said, I know it's a little bit more of an out there topic, but at the same time, what I like to tell people is you don't have to think of it as something like, what is structure in wine? Well, what is structure in a building? Like, what is structure, I don't know, like in a novel? It is the framework. That's what it is, I always say, like, when I think about any of Gaudi's architecture, of how there is very rarely any straight lines and everything's like woven and, arching towards the sky, I think about 2011. It's actually an image like of our wines from 2011. That's the image that I have. When I think about 2013, I think the Notre Dame Cathedral, like something that is symmetrical, straight, like deeply anchored, like strong bones, but there's still elegance within it. When I think about 2012, I actually don't have an architecture image in it, but those wines are monsters, but with gentle souls. And then when you think about 14 and 17, they have the structure of Brussels lace. They're almost transparent. So structure in wine, it's not this crazily philosophical out there concept. It is very, it is perceptible. In whites, you will tend to be able to tell it through, like, acidity is a structure builder, and so is like tannin. And the way we make whites, there is some tannin there, or the presence of the fruit. When the wine stays in your mouth, and you have to have like 3 rather than 5 like what's it called, like sips of water to clear it out of your mouth. And I mean, if it's a good wine, I mean, it's because of structure. When a wine flows through your mouth in a very gentle kind of way, that is a completely different kind of structure. And generally speaking, also the kind of structure that will allow you to enjoy the wine earlier. We are very, very happy to have wines like that, because if we didn't have 2014 or 17, well, nobody would be having Kenny Pearl Morissette right now, like when it comes from the top guys. And there are wines that are much readier to give you pleasure, but that doesn't necessarily mean they will not last as long as the other ones. Probably not in the long term, but we're talking about the difference between 15 and 25 years. We're not talking like 2 years and 10 years. It's completely different proposition. And when you think about how much importance we give to grapes, I think what grapes are good for is kind of like the initial appreciation or understanding of your own palate. Do you prefer high acidity? Like, I can tell you right now, like, I've done tastings with so many people over the years, people that like high acidity, not only in wine, in food as well. In white, they will choose Riesling. In red, they will choose Gamay. It's, and in that sense, like, Gamay is the red Riesling and Riesling is the red Gamay. The white Gamay. People that like more like comforting, mellow, whether it's like buttery or honeyed aromas, more warmth, they go for Chardonnay, and then they go for Pinot Noir. Like, because those are wines that wrap around you. They don't electrify you the same way that Riesling and Gamay will. They provide you with pleasure in a completely different way. And then Cabernet Franc is Cabernet Franc. It's like that one is kind of thing that I don't know that I've met anyone, and if there's one of you out there, let me know if you don't like Cabernet Franc, or if you haven't liked Pearl Morissette Cabernet Franc. But that's generally the grape where everybody it's like there's no arguing with. It's bigger than your taste. It's bigger than everything around it, at least like in Niagara. Okay, so let me look at some questions. See, I said I'm going to talk for 30 minutes, 54 minutes and counting. So much for being brief. Okay, based on what you're explaining, what is the rationale of releasing the Prim Souti and the Ruslana from 2019? That is a very good question, and we're going to talk in depth about these wines next week. So those are wines made in a completely different way. They come from much younger vines, in the case of the Prim Souti, and in the case of the Ruslana, it's Rosé. So structurally speaking, with Rosé, you can rarely have as much structure as you would do in a white or a red, just because the wine is in a contact with the skins for a way shorter period of time. So, and again, another thing about structure that we didn't discuss today is the fact that in order to allow it to develop fully, if you have the material, you also, the wine has to go through a different process of aging, you know, a much, 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 much longer time, um, obviously depending on the vintage. So when we were tasting that Lemberger, um, like it was explosive. Like the first year we worked with it was 2018, and we were so smitten with it that like we wanted it again. And what Lemberger is good for is giving you very smooth type of structure. Like its tannins are so round, an explosive attitude, an outburst of all sorts of flavors. And that is the energy of the grape. That is the like there are also young vines, the Lemberger vines, and you cannot force complexity on them, just like you cannot force complexity on the younger vines that we have or had in the vineyard behind me that used to traditionally make the métisses. They're wines that want to run around. They're wines that want to engage with. They don't have like very deep, wise things to say, but they have a lot of pleasure to give, and they give it freely. Lemberger is just like that. Same thing with the Roslana. Um, in like, I'm gonna make a pronouncement right now that probably is gonna turn a lot of people's eyes or heads. My favorite wine of the current lineup of release is the Prim Sauté, the Lemberger. I absolutely love it. And I'm saying that loving full well the Roslana, and even more so because, you know, how do you call it? Uh, just a little bit of what can be considered an immodest highlight here. It has like it was initially named after me because I'm such a, like, I just love certain type of rosés, and the Roslana is the exact type from 2016, the last vintage, to now the 2019. I love that kind of rosé that drinks so beautifully and so easily, but has spunk in it, has resounding structure. Loving it as much as I do, I still drink Prim Sauté in probably 3-to-1 ratio to the Roslana, because even though it's a rosé, to me the structure in there is so much more complex that the wine will probably take a couple of more months to start fully manifesting how great it is. While the Prim Sauté is like join the ride. It's absolutely amazing. But again, those are wines of a completely different attitude. Those are wines to be enjoyed in their youth. And it's not to say that they're not going to age. They will age for at least like 3, 5, like 7 years, but they're not made for that. They're not made for the spirit of, let me figure out how much more you can give me. Because we know that in their essence, their DNA is much simpler coming from younger vines than any of the 19e Madeleine and Black Ball from 19th Street Vineyard. It's a completely different type of attitude. And the one thing, we actually, it's the first year we do it, because we thought, I haven't written about it yet, but it's a very good visual way of understanding how we think about the seriousness of our wines. Whenever the seriousness of the structure of our wines, whenever you see a Pearl Morrison wine that has a bright colored label, Prim Sauté Roslana, we're gonna have another wine that I'm obsessed with, 100% Cabernet Sauvignon, that like, it's not the Cabernet Sauvignon you think of when you think of Cabernet Sauvignon. It drinks by the bucket. That's gonna come later in the summer. All of those wines with the bright colored label are made in that spirit of generosity and respecting and honoring the youth and the explosiveness of the vines. When you see a white Pearl Morissette label, which is the original Pearl Morissette label, those are our quote unquote top guns, flagship cuvées. Those wines will only get better with age. The young guys with the bright color label, they will age, but they won't necessarily gain after a certain period of time. While the other ones, they will reward you for your patience. I just yesterday was it? I had a email from an old customer of ours who had just opened the 2013 Pinot that he had cellared for years, and he had also drunk and loved before, and it was one of those, like, pardon my French, holy fuck, Svetlana, what is happening here? And what, like, I don't know in terms of chemical equations of what is happening, but we've had uh, the same reaction with the 2013 Pinot as well, actually, about a month or two ago, where you think you know the wine, you forget about it, then you open a bottle, and the wine's had enough time, it will give you back in spades. Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, the young wines, not the same thing. Like, they will be in their best, like, now and in the year to come, and then afterwards we'll probably, like, just go on a plateau and still be in a fine shape, but would not necessarily adding to their expression. Okay, how much, oops, let's see, two questions. How much spare capacity do you guys have in the winery when you're keeping back vintages in vessels for 5 years? That is a question from Eric. Oh, well, Eric, that is the juggling that needs to get done. It's so thankfully the 2015 was a small harvest. So when it came to keeping the Cabernet Franc, that was one barrel and one big foudre. 2016 Madeleine was also a relatively small harvest. That's two additional foudre, but it adds up over the years. So if you are in a situation where you have 4 or 5 very structured vintages in a row, you have to, like, I mean, unless you build another winery, which we don't want to do, you will have to bottle some, and you'll have to use your best judgment of what to bottle and what not. And we are actually in a, like, we're gonna be facing those questions very soon, because with the new leased vineyard that we've been farming since last year, we have more volume, and it's a vineyard. It's got a lot of different grapes on it. Some of them are really structured, some of them are like just very young vines, but some of them have the capacity to rival our 19th Street bottlings. And we only have a set amount of foudre and a set amount of tanks. So let's talk in a year. So far, so good. But again, we just had our first harvest from there. We haven't been in a situation where we have two successive harvests with the kind of, like, with the tonnage of fruit that we currently get, and try to somehow get it all to fit. You know, it's amazing how much space you can find when you're really looking for it. But I'm sure at some point it'll have its limit. Okay. Okay. Victoria would like you to describe flesh in a similar way you describe structure. Oof. Well, I think we should probably have another one on that, because it's as big of a question as structure is. But when I talk about flesh, I talk about, like, that to me is another way of saying texture. So going back to the comparison between you know, like, and I mean, I know it's anthropomorphic, but I find it useful. Um, and I can use buildings as well. There's, if you go back to the human body, you have the bones, and you can be big bone or fine boned or whatever, but that is all structure. Then you have your flesh or meat, like your muscles and your tendons. It's a much more pliant, um, and uh, soft. It doesn't necessarily need to be soft, but you know, you can have the muscles of a, like, what's it called, a sprinter. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen like sprint races where their calves are like so high up, and like they're round like bows because they hold explosive power. That's that kind of flesh. And compare that to the muscles of a swimmer that are very long and produce completely different type of power. So texture in wine, it's very similar to that. Or if you are looking at a building, you know, it's got its bones, it's got its blueprint, but then it's the material with which it's executed. Is it glass? Is it brick? Is it concrete? Or is it whatever else, whatever other building material is out there that I cannot think of? So like all of them have different tactile um, experiences and inform the character of the wine. You cannot disassociate structure from texture, but they're two different things. You know, you, if you have only bones, you have a skeleton. But if you have only flesh, like, I don't know what you have, like a, like just like nothing. Like something needs to hold that flesh. So it's a very synergetic relationship, and the balance between those two things is absolutely not dependent on us. What's dependent on us is doing our best to reflect it in the best to reflect what the vineyard and the grape variety and the climatic conditions have given us. But those things are not, like, at least in our winery, are not designed. They're just aspects of, you know, or the same thing if you think of an apple, like just another like fruit. Like you have apples that are juicy and you have apples that are mealy. That's their texture. And you know, you have apples that are like much thicker skinned, and you have apples that are thinner skinned. Again, the texture of your experience, like or how you cook a steak, like rare, medium rare, and what that does to the experiences on your palate. Same thing. That is all texture, texture, texture. And again, it's a lot of people, especially in wine, use texture and structure interchangeably. For us, they're two completely different things, but they're extremely synergetic. Right. Okay. Oh my God, Joe Wilcox. That's amazing. Hi, Joe. Joe's an old friend. I may have missed the answer already, but how are the 2014s performing right now, particularly the Montigny Gamay? Okay. If Andrew Lamanti is still here, oh yeah, he is. He just had a 2013 Gamay impress him so much that he wrote me a newsletter, an email about it. Francois and I had a 2013 Gamay. When was it? Like 2 weeks ago, because we just wanted to check in on it. It is pretty amazing. What I said in my response to Andrew, it was fascinating because first and foremost, for those of you that don't know, the 2013 Gamay is the first time we did a Gamay. Secondly, it's done with no sulfur additions of any kind, which we generally put like extremely, extremely small additions anyway. but still, like zero additions whatsoever in a grape that we haven't worked with before. I'm like, it's a ballsy move. It was definitely a ballsy move. To see the wine right now, and that is the kind of wine, by the way, that when we released it also shut down. And like when Gamay shuts down, it stinks to high heaven. It is not, you can smell it like 15 meters away. It's called, like, technical terms, reduction, but it's not like, oh, I had all these like waterfalls of cherries and violets and blueberries before, and now, like, pardon me, but all you can smell is baby diaper, because that's how reduction can smell in a wine, in Gamay especially. So we are so obsessed with that wine. We still are. And then we started shipping it, and then the wine shut down, and you could not believe the difference. So it went through its closure phase and then slowly started like settling in, and it was like singing. And then it's a very small production anyway, and it's one of those like extremely special bottles even here in our cellar, because it's the first one of its kind. um, but we're very curious, and when Francois and I were tasting it, we tasted it with a very, like, I mean, like, extremely objective, like clinical, uh, zero sentimentality type of attitude towards it. And it is fascinating to understand that a wine, again, that comes from fruit that at that point we did not farm, that again is not necessarily benefited from any expertise, because we didn't have that expertise with Gamay, and that does not have the extra prop of a little bit of sulfur to keep it stable, has completely preserved its freshness, has digested all of its attitude, and what it's showing now, it's much more nuanced. I think I was probably the person that did the most pump overs on that wine, which is something that you do over it, like during fermentation. And I remember, and Francois always told me, like, whenever you're doing the pump overs, pay attention to the smells, because those are kinds of things that will disappear for a very long time. And once the wine starts progressing through fermentation and then élevage and then goes to bottle, so if you've done your job correctly, they will reemerge somewhere down the line. And when I tasted it when we were tasting it 2 weeks ago, is the first time that it smelled like what the tank used to smell like. It's in perfect shape. How much longer it'll go? Uh, I wouldn't say another 10 years, but like probably another 5 will be in this, like it's in a beautiful, beautiful spot. And I can't, like, we have a Gamay from 2019, just very little in the cellar, because now we have access to that fruit again. Gamay, apart from Cabernet Franc, is our definitely our most favorite grape variety. But now Lemberger is giving it a run for its money as well. The rest of the 2013s are a different story, because the Gamay is it's an outlier. And 2013 is definitely not as deep rooted and not as structured as 12 or 15, but it's not far behind either. Last week or whenever we tasted the Cabernet Francs, we tasted a 2013 Madeleine, and I was absolutely taken with it. The 2013 Black Bowl has been in a beautiful, like, it's probably my favorite Black Bowl to drink right now, the 2013. The 13s are so good because they have all the structure in the world you want, but through their development in bottle, they've rarely had any closure, like hard closure phases. They're the wines, I would say, that have given us the least amount of worry overall, and have been like extremely classic, extremely like precise. The phases that they're entering now, it's when they're starting to reveal more of their soul. um the only one that I can't talk about like fully is the 13 Chardonnay, but only because I have not tasted it probably like 6 or 7 months. But the rest of them are lovely, and still a lot of time in front of them. Yeah, and the Gamay is, it's a it's a joyride. Okay, Andrew. Hi, Andrew. Andrew, can you speak a bit about the 2009 Pinot release? Oof, when did we? I don't even remember when we released that wine. It was probably a couple of years ago, and that was mostly to, if I remember correctly, to Black Bow customers, Black Bow Wine Society members, because that's a wine just like the 2009 Riesling that took a long time to come around, very long time. It was only the second Pinot done here in the property. And 2009, apart from the Riesling and the Pinot that were just released 2 years ago, whenever it was, the only other wine from that year is 2009 Chardonnay. It's a very structured vintage because it's one of the truly cool vintages in Niagara. Well, the true cool vintage in Niagara. Nothing else has been like as cool as 2009. And the 2009 Chardonnay has been around for longer than the Riesling and the Pinot, but but it also was never officially released. It kind of got sold out by people constantly asking for it because it was a very Francois will tell you that the 2009 Chard is when, because it's only the second Chard here, when he was doing Burgundy in Niagara, when he wasn't doing Niagara. And people were absolutely obsessed with it. It's a beautiful wine. We just had it last week comparing the 2008 and 2009. It's very, very fresh, absolutely lovely. I wouldn't be exaggerating if I said that it's still not fully open. And the same thing is true about the Riesling. That was the first Riesling, and it's not actually a black bow because Francois followed the recipe of the area and left some residual sugar. The Pinot, I it's not as structured as the Riesling and as the Chardonnay, but it was a very it's a very interesting wine, that wine, because it drinks absolutely beautifully, um, but it doesn't really carry the type of bone structure that I've come to associate with our wines. And that may very well be a particularity of Pinot in that vintage, because obviously, like, Pinot in and of itself is a completely, how do I put it? It's not a grape variety that announces its power through like big bones. Like I always talk about, Pinot is power without weight. Um, we like the restaurant here at the farm, when they were open, they would use it a lot with pairings because it's an evolved wine that still feels very fresh. If you have it, again, it's the same thing as the 2013 Gamay. Well, it's a little bit different, but I wouldn't be aging it like for much, much longer. When we released it, it was probably already like 9 or 10 years old. Um, so it's in a very good spot to enjoy. And I don't think in another 10 years, it has the capacity to enrich itself to a point that another 10 years of aging are worth it. Okay. Okay, can you please tell us a little bit about the Métis collection and especially the Chardonnay? So the Métisses are wines that now that absolutely everybody loves them, we are not going to, well, let me not make big pronouncements. The last vintage of Métis that's available, and that is at all in, well, it's not like there's nothing in the making of Métis past 2017. Why that is, it's because the Métisses were wines made kind of with the same idea as the Roslana and the Prim Sauté. They're wines of openness, generosity, like early pleasure, all of those things, because they happen to come from the vineyard that you can no longer see, but it's right behind me. That's our home farm vineyard, and that vineyard was made until 2017 was used for like pretty much 99% Métis. The vines there were very young. They were planted between um, 2009 and 2012. So when vines are young, they produce grape varieties that give you they produce fruit that has a lot of crunchiness, has a lot of how do you put it, like baby cheeks, that's what Francois calls them. They have a lot of brightness. And we traditionally kept those wines for restaurant and export partners, because obviously there's very little of them and so on and so forth, and because they're more suitable for, like a restaurant that wants to pour the wines by the glass. They'd much rather work with something that it's more easygoing in attitude, rather than have to decant a bottle for a few hours. I mean, like some restaurants do that as well, but the Métis wines are wines you can age them, definitely, but they're wines made with the spirit, like with the idea of enjoying the spirit of youth. Whenever they have like very, very good fruit within them, but rather than masking that fruit and imposing structure on it, what we've decided to do is celebrate its youth, because already uh, there's no more Chardonnay Métis coming from here, because the vines became of age when they started expressing in a much more serious way. And now that was the first Fougue in 2017 that was released. The next one we're bottling in the fall. The first Cabernet Franc from here that is no longer going to be Métis, but a completely different cuvée. Um, because again, the vines have reached a point of maturity where no longer expressing just the grape variety, talking about grape varieties again, but they're expressing a few other elements, be it, the climatic conditions, the soils, the character of that vineyard in particular. And it was fascinating to discover that just through working with the vines as they continued to mature. So then they graduate to a different type of level of wines, and we see what happens from then on. But that Cabernet Franc that just got into bottle last week, and now it's gonna chill out there. It's called, this is breaking news right here. Nobody else knows about that. Nobody even knows there's gonna be a second vineyard, uh, single vineyard Cabernet Franc at Pearl Morissette. Racine du ciel, which is the root of the sky. But I'm not going to start telling you why, because that's 45 minutes. But yeah, so the Métisses are wines of pleasure, wines of engagement, wines of like generosity. If you have a Métis Chardonnay from 17, that's completely different than Cuvée 19 from 2017. The Cuvée 19 right now, it's drinking beautifully, but it's at about probably like 35% of showing you what it has, while the Métis Blanc is like truly singing and exploding out of the glass. Why? Because it comes from younger vines. And with younger vines, 3 years in, that's what you can expect. Okay. Oh, somebody's asking me about me being stuck on deserted island. That's amazing. Let's see. Oh, you're stuck on a deserted island and could only take one bottle of Pearl Morissette with you. Which bottle and vintage is it? That's from Matt Granahan. Uh, 2012 Black Ball. That is, I mean, I say that because that's a wine that I've been long obsessed with, and it always brings out like an extreme amount of emotion out of me. And I think it's one of the wines of utmost like magnitude and deepest um, structure. And I like those things. Francois calls me a structure freak, which I guess we both are. But plus, I think like just to be fully objective with myself, 2012 was my first vintage here. It was just like four of us, three of us, well, four of us, including the vineyard manager. And we, like, I mean, since then I've known every um, single wine of Pearl Morissette from, vine bloom until bottle. But that was it was my first encounter with the power of the wines of Pearl Morissette, and I absolutely love the 2012 Black Bowl in a way that is not fair to the rest of the wines. That being said, you know, it's a very tough choice to make because I love the Rose, like I'm currently obsessing with the Roslana. Like, and on a desert island, it's probably gonna be a much better choice than a 2012 Black Bowl. Um, I have like in every like I kind of have a in every vintage have like a favorite, and most of the time those favorites don't necessarily have to do with the wine being better than the others, but with the meaning of the wine itself, what we have discovered through it, um, or whether like the 2017 Chardonnay, holy moly, like I love it so much now, and I don't even dare think about how how much greatness this wine carries, because when it comes to 19, it is honestly like we climb the staircase and climb the staircase and climb the staircase with the different vintages. And when 2017 came, it's almost everything that we've learned came together. And then we jumped a couple of floors up. Like that wine is absolutely fantastic. It's not advertising it right now because it is so young, but that's what I have in my glass right now. And that is also a wine that I'm definitely going to on a desert island too. But if it was a one bottle, it will be the 2012 Black Bowl. Um, but again, that I think has more to do with my personal I mean, it's a great wine. It's one of the greatest wines that we've made, but it also has more to do with my personal connection to it than with it being greater in like that much greater than anything else. Okay, prospective lifespan of the Gamay. Drink now or hold until depend on hold until 20 something something. That's from Joel. Depends how many bottles you have, Joel. If you have more than one, drink one now because it is absolutely great. If you have just one, well, I don't know. I don't know what you say because I don't think, as I was saying, like I don't like a lifespan in terms of the wine getting tired. It probably's got another 10 years in it. That being said, I don't know that the journey through those next 10 years will be on an upward curve for much longer. I think it's pretty close to reaching its full potential. But that again is like the my best assumption or most educated guess. Okay, Tatiana says, can't stop thinking about the game now. It sounds unreal. Would you recommend opening a 2012 19 to have during next week's chat? You can, but next week we're discussing the Roslana and the Prim Suti, which, I mean, you can open anything you want, but the Roslana and the Prim Suti are the type of wines that I was saying before are so full of like life, pleasure, and their structures are much more fluid. The 2012 19, it's another one of like just coming from, again, a vintage that gave us like arguably some of the most structured wines we've ever done. It's on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. So most of the time, most of the stuff that we'll be talking about next week will be about wines of a completely different character. Um, but why not? You know, you can. The 12 19 is a beautiful wine, and much like the 12 Black Bow or the 12 Madeleine, those are wines that are very generous, but they're only generous because they come from a generous vintage, and they have a lot more coming. A lot, like 2012 and most likely 2018, but we can't say anything right now because the wines from 2018 are like still in élevage for the most part, are the two most structured, most deep rooted, like Francois calls them 40-year-old wines, meaning that it'll take at least 40 years for them to reach their full potential. Thanks for letting us watch the sunset in Niagara. Well, thank you. I hope it worked out. Uh, it was raining earlier, and I just, as I was saying in the beginning, I kind of just didn't want to go into the cellar this time around. It's been so lovely to sit here at the end of the day and uh, see, you know, the sunset, and just, it's pretty much, life is so powerful right now, and it's galloping with so much strength. Like you can almost hear it. You can hear the friggin' like leaves opening. It's fascinating. And maybe next week, uh hopefully it's good weather, and we can do it outside again, and I can start like if you like, whenever you guys sign up, like I'll make a point of sending an email maybe a day before and telling you if you can sign up 15 minutes or so before, so um, we can just walk over to the vineyard and I can show you what's going on there, and I can give you the big overview of the most important symbol that is a vase that is here on the farm, which is the chestnut tree that I'm sitting under. Okay, Tatiana says, I have those. Oh yeah, you have the two, the Roslana and Primso tea that arrived today. Awesome. So we will open those. Yes, absolutely. Next week will be a wild party of explosive reds and a rosé. I don't even know how to describe the rosé, because as Francois was saying the other day, and it was in a very positive. If you've had the rosé already, when I tell you it drinks like water, you know what I mean. I don't mean it as like it doesn't have flavor. It means like you open the rosé while you're cooking dinner or something in order to have a glass and have the rest with dinner. Guess what? It's gone. At least that's what happens around here. It is gone. It's so beautiful, and it's not, but at the same time, try and have it. The restaurant had a beautiful thing in their last country market when they had a lamb offering. I forget exact what preparation is, but spring lamb with that rosé is like an invitation for a completely different universe or like register of pleasure. What I mean by that is you can crush it on the patio or like while cooking dinner, like no tomorrow, but sit down with the rosé and with a meal of a much stronger flavors and much deeper textures, and you will see the rosé rising to the challenge with absolutely no problem. And don't even get me started on the Prince tea. That's for the next week. Which to open, Rosé and Lemberger next week, Andrew? Uh, I like open. Well, I mean, I don't know how much you want to drink, but open both. They're both 12%. How bad can it be? And it's like whichever one you don't finish, it's like they're not gonna go bad in the next couple of days. But I plan to open both. So uh well, that is it, guys. 9:36, an hour and 36 minutes. I hope you enjoy that. And I'm just and like saw myself finally. I'm like, this is a very kind of, I mean, I don't know whether it's spooky or nice. I kind of like it, like the background, I mean, better than the foudre in the winery. It just gives you at least an understanding of what we're living through now. And hopefully we get to do that again next week, because drinking those bottles outside under the chestnut tree in a beautiful, perfect day, that's exactly what they were designed for. Not designed, you know what I mean. That's exactly what their spirit is. But thanks again to everyone for joining in. Without sounding too repetitive, if you have any questions, please send them over. Or the other thing I wanted to say, knowing what we're going to be tasting next week, and maybe even enjoying these wines between now and then, if you have a question or like a series of questions that come to mind, put them together, send me an email, and then I'll answer them as we go through the tasting next week. So thanks again, and hopefully nobody's finished yet with their bottles of Pearl Morissette, or if you are, good for you. But I do have a Cabernet Franc from 2017 that I did not even taste because, as usual, was so busy talking. So that's what I'm gonna do with the rest of my evening. So thanks, everyone. Have a good evening, and I will see you tomorrow. Not tomorrow, next Thursday. Bye.